about it all the time and not necessarily doing every single experiment, which takes a lot of patience and a lot of you have to be in it for the long game, let's say. So a few years in, I decided to start looking around and seeing what was out there, and I honestly didn't even know that science writing was an option as a career. So I just went to as many career panels as I could, and I met one of my first mentors, Carmen Drawl, who works at Chemical and Engineering News, and now she's across the hall from me. Um, and she sort of told me about like the science writing community that's out there, which it's really a small and inclusive community, I think. Um, and she recommended that I start a blog, she gave me all of these resources, recommended that I take a class, and I basically followed all of her advice like to a T. So I started a blog. I took a class while I was in grad school. I basically I would write for anybody who would let me. And at the beginning, that does mean writing for free. So I would write for my school magazine. I blogged for a journal. I was an editor that edited journal articles for non-English speakers. And so by the time I graduated my PhD and I was looking for a job, I had a good, I don't know, about like, so the advice I got was when you are looking for a job, you want to have like a few clips that you're proud of, and that's really what you need. So I had a few clips, and I applied for a job at Princeton to be a science writer for their chemistry department, and then also for a fellowship with the Open Notebook, which is a really great resource that is all about the craft of science writing. And that was a really great opportunity because not only did they pair me with a mentor, so spoiler, I got the fellowship, and it really did change my path. They paired me with a mentor, and it gave me the opportunity to write about the craft. So I got to interview all of these top editors and writers and ask them like really dumb questions, really simple questions of like, exactly how do you write a story, so that I could, share that with other people. So after graduation, I started at Princeton as a science communicator. So it's a little bit different than science journalism. So as what it's called a public information officer. So you work directly with the scientists to write the press releases. And we can go into the finer points later if you guys want. But so I did that, and then the Open Notebook at the same time. And after that fellowship ended, I started becoming interested in doing more freelance writing. So I started slowly backing away from Princeton and, working about 50% time. And then for the rest of the time, I started freelancing, and I wrote stories for Scientific American, New Scientist, Vice. I wrote some scripts for TED Ed, which were really fun. Video was always, I was always very interested in that, and entered as many contests as I could. Contests are a really great way of like getting to know other people in the science writing community and getting feedback from people you probably admire. So that was about 3 years after my PhD. I was at Princeton and then doing all these freelancing things. And just as I was ready to move on and sort of go 100% into freelancing, I sort of got the call from Chemical and Engineering News. They let me know that they had a position open, and I went for it, and the timing just worked out perfectly, and I started there last July. And it's been a really great experience. So that's pretty much where we are now.
It's one of the things that I think a lot of people experience in high school and college is there's a common misconception that you either have to go into a STEM field or like a language arts field. So I think it's really amazing that you've been able to combine the two like throughout your career. And that's exactly what we're doing here at CSW is, taking complex science topics and really simplifying them so that people who don't necessarily have a strong background in science can understand them. And with that, I would like to ask you what you think what is the importance of science communication to the public?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I was looking at these earlier. So I think it's different for everybody. If you are doing science communication, obviously you're drawn to it in some way. It has some meaning for you. Um, for me, I'd say it's science is the way that I make sense of the world. Um, and yeah, I think for me, it's more about I'm not trying to force people to learn. Like I feel like a lot of people, I mean, no one really wants to be lectured at or told why they need to um, know something. I think they'd prefer, you sharing your genuine enthusiasm or you think something is really interesting, and people can tell from your writing um, whether you're into it or not. So I'd say that, I mean, obviously, science science writing and science itself is really important because it values rational thought and facts, which are important these days. Um, but I think that you have to find your own meaning in science writing. What do you like about it? Are you trying to convince people of something, or are you just trying to share your enthusiasm um, and help people, understand a little bit more about the way that things work?
Yeah. My first year in CSW, we had a speaker come in at the first forum, and one of the things that struck me the most, I haven't forgotten this since, is that um, a lot of times when people, like one of their family members has a disease and they want to learn more about it, a lot of times, like articles that show up, they can be difficult to understand, and having like organizations first, like CSW, for example, where these complex topics have been made easier to understand, it can provide like almost provide hope for patients' families and things like that. So I think that could be
Yeah,
another really important factor of science communication.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. So you mentioned in the past you've worked with scientists to help communicate their findings. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that researchers should advocate for their own research, or do you think people such as yourself who are skilled in um, simplifying complex topics, do you think that you should take a larger role in disseminating like researchers' findings and experiments?
Mm. I would say since I've been in graduate school, there's been like every year there's a bigger push for scientists to communicate their science. There's all of these workshops, there's contests, there's um, if you're on Twitter, people are constantly talking about the importance of sharing your science, especially since it's a taxpayer funded endeavor. So it's almost like people have a right to know. But on the same token, not everybody is passionate about breaking things down. And it's totally okay to just love doing science, um, and that's the way that you contribute. So I would really resist like trying to tell scientists that they have to do really anything with science communication. You know, it'd be great if at least they were like helpful to science communicators, like ourselves. And for the most part, um, scientists are really great to work for. I mean, they all of the people that I've interviewed like over the past few years, they're just so generous with their time, and I think they do care about people understanding. And it's sometimes not everyone is going to understand exactly what you do, but even giving people appreciation for how science works. I think that's one of the things that people run into when there's criticism of science journalism of like, okay, this one study says like coffee is great, and this other one says it's awful. And people criticize that because they think scientists are just like all knowing. But when things change, that's actually science working. That's
Mhm.
like scientists saying like, we're willing to be wrong, and give you all the facts in context. So yeah, basically, I think it's up to the scientists, and any way that they can help us get the message out if they don't feel comfortable doing so themselves. I think that's great.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for distinguishing between kind of like pseudoscience and real science, especially in the age of social media? I know there's often a confusion, and people when do you think is the right time to be skeptical of science that you're reading?
I mean, I think you can always be skeptical of the science that you're reading. And it's tough because there is so many articles out there. I'd say, I mean, all of these outlets are not immune to bad articles sneaking in, but I would say that if you start to cultivate like, a handful of news outlets or websites that you trust, or at least, maybe some scientists or know some science writers, and you have like a community that you can draw on and say like, I've read this article and I'm just not sure if it's legit or not. I don't think there's an easy answer of like, okay, if they use this language, it's bad. I think that you need to sort of cultivate a network of people that you trust and sort of put that through the filter. And sometimes people can, it's not always made up science. It's just that the field actually doesn't agree. And it's okay to just live with some uncertainty there. Um, so yeah, I guess bottom line is ask as many people as you trust as possible.
Okay. Um, so do you think that there's a difference between a science writer and a science journalist?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that, and science writers really can be found in so many different places. I did have a short, let's see, a resource that I borrowed from my colleague Jillian Kemsley. She has this list of where science writers work. Um, and so they can be in traditional media, but also in science societies, universities, hospitals, research institutes, government agencies, museums, um, even private companies, um, and journalists. So I'd say the main distinction is that journalists are bound by certain rules. You know, if you're a science journalist, then you'd be sure explaining a topic, but you'd have expert sources that you would use. You also have you'd have sort of a more strict sense of sort of the picture that you're trying to paint. You want to make sure that you're presenting an unbiased uh, presentation of the facts. Not to say that you would as a science writer, but you know, if you're a science writer, your main objective might just be to help someone understand something. Um, and as a journalist, you have to be really careful about um, sort of the perspective and point of view that you are bringing, um, and in making sure that you remain impartial and in presenting the facts.
So at CSW, do you think that the work we do is more in line with the science writer or science journalist kind of work?
Um, I did have a look at some of, so you guys, and you guys do interview researchers, right?
Yes, we
Um, yeah, I'd say, let me think.
do.
I
Basically,
had a,
or
okay.
the premise of the organization is we interview a researcher to make sure we have I guess our facts correct, and then we present their findings in a simplified manner.
Mhm. Yeah. So the reason that I'm sort of hesitating, I think you guys occupy an interesting space in between there because if you look at news organizations, we're driven by news and certain studies, or and I guess I don't know enough about your organization. If you guys are, I think with science writing, you can just explain a topic a little bit more, whereas with science journalism, you have to have a really specific sort of story or question that you're answering, or you really have to lead with what's new. I haven't really read enough of the articles to know if that's like one of your goals, or if your goal is more just helping people understand a certain disease or part of a disease.
I think it's definitely the latter. It's just making sure that like, these topics are easier for people to understand generally. So, as a science writer, what steps do you take to make complex topics more easy to understand for
Um, so I was thinking about this, and I was sort of working backwards. So some really practical advice that I've heard, and I do think works if you have the time, is always read what you have out loud. If once you read it out loud, and if you trip over something that you just wrote, that's like a reader is going to have trouble following that. Um, and so when you say those things, when you say the words out loud, it sort of becomes immediately obvious
it?
where you might get tripped up. Um, but I think for science writing in particular, it's the most important thing to me is structure. So whether or not someone is going to understand what you're trying to say is whether you've structured it in a way that they can follow, which means that with each sentence, you've given them just enough information that they need to follow you to the next sentence, and sort of no more than that, because that's where you quickly lose people. Or if you, I mean, you can use all the tricks of storytelling, analogies, or lively language, getting rid of adverbs, which generally are not your friend. I would recommend this. Actually, I have this right here. This book by William Zinsser on writing well, um, and it really changed the way I wrote almost immediately. He explains, like, he has drafts of things, like his first draft, and then he actually like shows you um, how he improves it. So taking out um, language that's passive, or weak verbs, or just information that doesn't need to be there just yet. Um, and that, I think I found that really helpful. Um, yeah, I think with complex topics, it's important that you really understand what the science is, because once you really understand it, then you can start making those leaps. So you can start, you know, coming up with like more fun analogies that still work. And it's really hard to find the right analogy. So, um, one that like people can picture immediately, like everything that you're doing is trying to make the reader's job as easy as possible. So like whatever analogy you come up with or visual, it needs to like pop to their mind like right away. Um, and these are all things that you can do to just help the reader along. And if you can put in that work like ahead of time, I think um, that would really go a long way to simplifying a topic.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you said that understanding it better makes it easier to present it. One year that when I was writing a story for CSW, I was really well versed in the topic that I was writing about, and I actually found it harder for me to like simplify it because to me it seemed, I guess, easy to understand, but to someone else who isn't as familiar with the topic, it was more difficult. So, do you ever encounter that
Yeah,
issue?
absolutely. Yeah. And actually, when I write about organic chemistry, I find that to be the toughest thing, because, yeah, it's like I know too much. Um, I think that, so that's definitely like a pitfall of knowing too much. But it does help you in terms of, once you're aware that take it for granted that you know about certain concepts, you can be like, hypersensitive to that fact, and use it to your advantage. Since you know it on a deeper level, find that extra analogy, or maybe some way that you learned it, that someone explained it to you, and sort of, well, steal however they did it. That's definitely a problem that I think the best of us face. So now I've forgotten the question. But,
I think you covered it pretty much. So I noticed on your website, I read your website and I read your blog, and I noticed that you really enjoy because it can be challenging, right? Taking these complex topics and simplifying them. So what do you think is the most challenging part of your job?
I'd say, so a lot of what I do, there's a lot of reporting that goes into these stories before you get to the writing stage, and that's really, I think, a really fun part, the researching and reporting stage. So you get to just learn as much as possible, and talk to as all these experts, and just ask them everything that you're wondering, ask them to explain it to you multiple times. That's generally the fun part. And I'd say the hardest part is actually sitting down to write and figuring out what to leave out. So that's really the hardest part. Like the best stories, I think, is when you have a lot of background information or extra information, and you basically have this pile of stuff that you've gathered, and you've like culled all the stuff that's like not exactly relevant to this one story that you're telling, and you just give people like the best 30% of what you learned. Like that will be the most compelling and most fun story for them to read. But figuring out what that 30% is, that's really tough. So I've my new thing now is I never used to write outlines, but I'm trying that now.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, you just sort of, I print it all out and surround myself with it, and sort of just mark out like, what are the best quotes? What are the most important points of the story? Um, you know, what could I not live without, in this story? Um, and that's, yeah, figuring out what to leave out. I'd say it's the hardest part.
Yeah, that's a good point. At CSW, between like picking your topic and then gathering all of the background information, writing, and then publishing, that entire process takes about several months usually. So how long does it take you usually to publish a story or an article?
Well, because I write for a weekly news magazine, we write uh, at least a story a week. We're usually, and a lot of online outlets these days, especially the new media outlets, reporters will be writing like a story a day. So the pace is can be pretty intense. Um, so generally, like a new paper will come out, and let's say I'll decide to cover it. I'll reach out to the researcher, interview them, send it out to other researchers, ask them what they think. That's also one distinction between science journalism and science writing, is that science journalism, generally you need to talk to other people instead of just taking sort of that one researcher's word for it. You have to make sure it's like sounds, and um, get a little bit more context for the readers. So yeah, after I've sent it out and heard back from people saying like, this is good work, this is newsworthy, um, I'll write the story, and that's generally like a couple days turnaround. And then larger stories, like feature stories, we'll generally be writing like one feature story a month. So, and a feature story. So for this last one, I did on solar geoengineering, and I interviewed about, gosh, probably like a dozen people, maybe like 15 people, um, just to really make sure I understood the issue. Um, and I ended up quoting uh, less than half of them. And
Mm.
so, but talking to those people who I didn't quote, it gave me an idea of what the community thought so that I could actually, figure out what's important and what the readers need to know. So even if you don't end up um, using certain interviews, it can be really helpful in sort of helping you explain things because now you understand things. Also, like you can go to these outside researchers and ask them like, if I write it like this, is that correct? Because
Mhm.
sometimes you just really won't know if you've butchered the science or not until you like actually write the sentence and ask somebody like, is this right?
That's really amazing that you can do all of that in 1 week for a process that can take us a few months to complete.
Well, it's really nothing helps you like a deadline when you have no choice. Um,
Yeah,
but it's great that you guys are coming up with these articles. I was really impressed with them.
yeah, it's pretty amazing. Do you have any advice for writers, I guess, who have trouble simplifying their topics and articles?
Yeah. So I guess what I would be curious about is sort of, is it because the topic is too broad, or if is it someone who's having difficulty uh, sort of putting it into lay terms? Uh,
Well, usually the whole process, a lot of the time goes into the background research and really making sure the information that we have is credible. So I think that's where a lot of the time goes to. It's not necessarily that the topic is too broad.
mhm.
So
Uh,
I used to have trouble simplifying my articles. This was when I first joined. My brother was a lot younger at the time, so if I for something that I thought was easy for me to understand, I would have my brother read it for me, like proofread it, and tell me if there was something that he didn't understand. I would simplify it,
mhm.
or things along those lines. Um, so, what do
Well,
you think it takes to be an effective science communicator?
um, I'd say I'd say it really depends. I mean, that's a tough question to ask to answer. I think that some of the best communicators I know are really aware of their audience, um, and they're able to sort of step back and I'm lucky enough to have an editor, multiple editors at CNN who always come after me, and they ask, their job is to ask the questions that would come up in the minds of a reader. And so they save me so many times from losing people, because at some point you get too deep into your story and you'll really have a hard time identifying those problem spots unless I mean, if you have the time, if you can just set it down and walk away and come back a few days later, sometimes these things will become more obvious to you. Um, and also just even before you start writing, like try to tell the entire story to someone who's either not a scientist or doesn't know anything about the topic, or is not even, let's say, like not even that interested, right? Like how do you, like, what strategies do you use to keep them sort of on the hook and wanting to know more? um, because not every science topic is inherently in itself going to be interesting. You have to find like is there like an interesting discovery story that you can take like angle to it, or who is doing the research? That's this, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Is the researcher a character, or if you're trying to describe a like a chemical reaction, can you make inanimate objects, like can you give them sort of personalities, or um, you know basically use any trick that you have to liven up your story. Um, I think that that just goes back to basic storytelling. Um, but in terms of just straight up simplifying, I think multiple iterations of edits is really helpful. Um, when someone has something to look at, they can give you advice of like this whole section. I didn't absolutely need it to understand the topic. Like it just slowed me down. You can just get rid of this whole paragraph. Um, I think someone told me at one point, like for most new writers, and this was certainly the case for me, like a lot of the times you could just delete my first two sentences and the story would be totally fine. Add a couple words there as a third sentence because that's where you really get into the meat of it. So you really want to like hook people right away. That was something I noticed when I was looking at the articles, which I think it's good to have the context of how many people are affected um, by a certain illness. But I would also say that a trap that I've fallen into myself is like saying 7 million people have this disorder, and you lead with that because that's like it is an impactful number, but if you are scrolling through and you're just reading an article, that's not necessarily going to make you feel empathy for or interested in this topic. Like, can you boil it down to like what one person would experience or one case? Um, I think it's much easier to relate and hook people with that. So like the more specific you can be, and avoid cliche at all costs. Um, I think that's a better bet.
That's really good advice. Thank you. I read a few of them of things that you published on your blog. It's called Must Love Science, right?
Mhm.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I was curious about why you wrote about yourself in the third person. And I also wanted to know what your favorite story was that you ever published.
um, I don't even so that was a few years ago now, and I think I wrote the about me in third person, but I don't think I wrote the other ones in third person. But I might be wrong.
I think I don't know. You would know better than me. I thought you did.
um, that was I really had never written uh, anything for that point. Like those were my first attempts at. I was only vaguely talking about science. I was mostly talking about life as a graduate student, and I
Mhm.
was talking about issues that were important to me at the time. I was really involved in this Women in Science group, um, and discussions that we were having. Um, and I found the blog really freeing, like to just try to find my voice and just find any way I could to keep people interested, but also like say it in a way that was true to myself. Um, and one of the resources I was going to share later is that the advantages of starting a blog, which I don't know, maybe you'd know better, but um, a few years ago, I mean, blogging in the science writing world was really big. I mean, you could start a blog and that could lead you to like a actual job. Um, it's a lot harder these days, and blog networks aren't as there aren't as many. So I'm not sure if that's still the case, but when I was blogging in 2013, that was sort of the tail end of when you could blog and sort of become a professional writer, use that as like a jumping off point. But it's still, especially in certain sciences, you become known to like that scientific field, and you become known to other writers, which is really helpful because like those are the people the science writing community is not that big, and once you become known to them and known to people that you're trying to get better, um, these are the people who will be hiring, who will be editors later on. So you can make some valuable connections through blogging. I think I got a few opportunities just from blogging. So I'd say it's a good exercise
Mhm.
um, to write regularly because and try to give yourself a deadline to do it. But it's really hard to like be to motivate yourself to do it. I think I had a whole category called "on not writing," in which I just like was apologizing to my whatever like dozens of readers that why I wasn't blogging because I was still a grad student.
Mhm. So, what was your favorite story that you've ever published?
Um, yeah, that's tough. Um, just because it's really the freshest in my mind right now, I'd say it's this cover story that I did for Chemical and Engineering News a few weeks ago now, and it's on solar geoengineering. So it's a method that scientists, some say it's a little bit crazy. For a long time, people wouldn't even talk about it because they were worried that it was too radical an idea. And so it's what some say isn't a solution to climate change. So the idea is that you would shoot chemicals, these sulfates, into the sky, and they would reflect sunlight and cool the planet. But who knows what happens when you shoot chemicals into the sky? So there's like a lot of risks. It could mess with precipitation. You know, there's questions of who gets to do it. Um, there's this question of if you do this, it turns out if you stop doing it, the temperature will rapidly increase and could be like catastrophic for biodiversity. So it was this really, I felt like it was a really interesting question. It was fascinating and terrifying. And the researchers, so it was these small group of researchers who were saying like, yes, it's a terrifying idea. And they were scared that, you know, what if we have people who are in our administration right now who don't believe in climate change? What if they see this as a quick fix and they like take our research and they don't use it in the way that we want them to, or they don't use it responsibly? So they were really afraid, but they were also saying like knowledge is better than ignorance. Like, what if we really do run out of options in 20 years and we need to like actually consider this as a real thing? Um, so I spent a lot of late nights worrying about like, am I getting this right? What if someone takes this article and if I don't put the proper context in there, you know, I was just really afraid how people might interpret it. So, and I wanted to be fair to the scientists. And there was a lot of other voices. There was NGOs who were, very opposed to even talking about geoengineering. Um, and then I just wanted to make sure that, people really need to understand what they're proposing and what the actual dangers are. So if I didn't do a good job of explaining that science, then maybe they might walk away with like the wrong idea. So I think that was one of the most stressful, but one of the most rewarding stories that I've done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a really interesting topic. Um, Before we conclude the interview, I want to ask you one last thing. I was wondering if you have any words of encouragement or advice for upcoming science communicators. Because, like you said, it is a small field, and I'm not sure how many people even know that they can combine the two. And like, if they are passionate about science and passionate about writing, what advice do you have for these people?
Yeah. Well, I think that I mean, it's great that you guys are like the work that you're already putting out. Um, and it's, as I said, it's a small field, but it's a really supportive field. And I think you'll get so many opportunities to get better. Like maybe the article that you write right now, especially if you are reading things and you could see when I first started, I would read things and I would know like my story does not sound the way I want it to. And I just didn't know how to fix it or didn't know how to get it to the level that I that I really felt was like effective. And it took a few years of, you know, continually trying. You know, what doesn't happen overnight. So I think that you can always be improving. I would definitely read people that you admire, sort of copy their tactics, you know, ways that they kept you engaged, or uh, any sort of tricks that they used. um, yeah, I think that we all need more science writers right now. So definitely stick with it. And if anyone has any questions, can feel free to uh, email me with specifics, because there are so many different ways you can take it in science writing. You could be a science journalist. You can write for all of these, you know, different places. You can do science video or science podcasting, and these different mediums do have, you know, do require different skills and are slightly different. Um, so maybe one of those you'll be better suited for than another. You never know. So if you have any specific questions, yeah, feel free to let me know.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I know at CSW we're all very happy to have you here again, and I think we all gained a lot of helpful insight, especially because I feel like a lot of your work, the basic premise mirrors a lot of what we do here at CSW. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to everyone else who attended.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
I think that, yeah, if you want more information about Dr. Nguyen, I'm not sure if you can see my screen. It's right here. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay. Yeah.
I really don't know how to use this software. I do.
And I'll send you, Akansha, I'll send you the resources I had mentioned earlier. I was going to.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. I'm happy to close out the webinar. I can give it another minute, Tien, to see if anybody has any questions that come in through the chat bar down at the bottom, or you can also raise your hands. So I'll just hold off for 1 second to see if anything comes in.
Okay.
The questions that have come in are just a few comments thanking you for your time, both you and Akansha, for putting this together and saying it was an interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, with that, I will be happy to close the webinar for everybody, and feel free to email Akansha and Dr. Nguyen and with any follow-up questions, and I'll be glad to make sure that everybody's email addresses are available to send out any additional information afterwards. So enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See ya.